the chairperson of the association, distinguished scholars, my fellow students, good afternoon. My name is Ikechukwu, and I'm most grateful for the invitation extended me to come and make a keynote contribution to today's discourse. And I'm happy that we all agreed on the topic because it goes to the heart of the matter. Let's dive right into it. I'd like to start with an illustrious quote. And it says, although it may be easy to possess power that is based on guns, it is, however, better to win the hearts of the people and to keep them. End of quote. You see, that quote is not mine. It belongs to a very, very bad man, a virulently terrible person. Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels was Adolf Hitler's advisor, counselor, very close friend, confidant, his thinker, his philosopher, his propagator, his propagandist. In fact, he ended up being the minister of propaganda for Hitler and Nazi Germany. When he wedded Hitler as the Führer, as the paramount leader, like the president, somebody much more powerful than the normal president because Hitler was a despot. Hitler was the best man to Goebbels in his wedding. As some of those guys, they ended up igniting the Second World War, in which over 70 million people died. So the question is, if such vile and evil men like Hitler and his murderous goons knew all along, despite their genocides and crimes against humanity, that the right, proper and productive manner to win power and to keep it was through an honest vote. How did that knowledge escape us, we political leaders of Nigeria? How? If such very bad people would know that if you want to win power, you have to win it through an honest vote. How did we miss out in that knowledge? Well, we didn't. We knew all along that the only potent and exercisable power the people can wield or should wield to hold us accountable is the power of honest vote. In fact, we knew that it is the prolonged absence of honest elections that led inexorably to the mass poverty and gross underdevelopment we have in the country today. Because if the people had been exercising the power of honest vote since 1960, when we had independence till date, Nigeria in 2025 would have developed into a first world nation by all standards and in all ramifications. We would have been like Europe. The problem we have is that since independence, almost 90 to 95% of the elections, parliamentary elections, when we had a parliamentary system, presidential elections, National Assembly, gubernatorial, state and state house of assembly, councillorship elections, 95% of these elections have been outright stolen or rigged or perverted or thwarted or nullified. And that means that Nigerians have never really voluntarily chosen their leaders. Neither have Nigerians ever been governed with their consent. Absence of honest elections makes our democracy a fake democracy, period. And no offense meant to all of us. If we could take Jean-Paul Sartre's epigram on existentialism, the one that rhymes, existence precedes essence, and analogize it to our discourse today, the epigram that emerges will be honest elections precede democracy, because ontologically, the fundamental reality of democracy is nothing but honest elections. Ontology is that branch of philosophy that deals with the study of existence, being, fundamental nature of reality. Put it simply, it means the study of what is, and which, when applied to a concept like democracy, will ask the question, what is democracy at its core? And the answer is honest elections. Could you repeat that for me? Yes, the answer is honest elections. What it shows is that honest elections are not merely a feature of democracy, but it is necessarily the constitutive element of its being. In Nigeria, the simple and painful reason why elections have been rigged all the time is that those people who have been vested with the power of appointing the electoral officers have by themselves been contestants, either by themselves or their political parties or their preferred candidates. They have been contestants in the same elections in which they appointed those who are conducting the elections. And it shows you there will be injustice, because the lawyers say, nemo judex in causa sua. Nobody can be a judge in his own case. Since independence, the power of appointing electoral personnel and electoral officers and electoral bodies have been vested when we had a parliamentary system in the prime minister, and when we had the presidential system in the president. The elections of 1964-65, it was such a big hassle, because the party of the prime minister had a collaboration, or if you may, let me just use it, a civilized word, collaboration. So the party of the prime minister who appointed the electoral officers had a deal with their local allies in the southwest. And the deal was, of course, the electoral body was much more sympathetic or participated in helping the party of the prime minister's local ally win the election. The election was skewed. And the aftermath of that rigging created such a major problem that exacerbated into a cataclysm that almost consumed the nation. When the presidential system came along, the power was vested with the president. And by 1999 Constitution, the power of appointing the electoral officers for the conduct of local government elections was devolved to the state governors. And you see, the world has been looking with askance or with amusement, depending on the inclination, as the Soviet Union-style numbers that have been reported from local government elections, where the party of the governor scores 100% victory. And the world had also been wondering, all the other elections held where the president has had the remit of appointing the electoral officers. It's the same thing, because they've been watching, listening to the loud cries, demonstrations, protestations, avalanche of court cases that attend these elections. Presidential, governorship, House of Assembly, National Assembly. The last election we had, 2023, we had almost 10,000 cases. Well, as we go on in this lecture, we are not talking about this particular president that is sitting now, or this particular ruling party now, or the governors now. We're talking about generic. That's whoever is there. The people who are aspiring to go there, the people who left, the people who will aspire in future. We're talking about the office, because it's the same. It's basically the same. In fact, the Senate president was quoted as saying that in the upcoming elections, the ruling party was going to score 99.9% victory. Colonel Abubakar Dangiwa Umar, the legendary military veteran who became the democracy and honest elections activist, he took it seriously, because he wrote a protestation to the president. So you need to shun these sycophants who make such predictions to you, inundated with such predictions. And you know how respectable Umar is to all of us. He took it seriously. He took it on a serious note. But on another serious note, it might be disingenuous for me to stand here testing out and self-preciously blaming others when I know that I'm part of the problem. Yes, I am part of that problem. Because all of us, politicians, political office holders, past, present, and military heads of government, former military heads of government, all of us are part of this big problem. Because each of us has at least benefited from a rigged election or acquiesced in a flawed election or perverted an election or superintended or directed the stealing of one election or thwarted one election or prevented the conduct of an election or nullified an election. So all of us, we have to confront this in order to get better. The election of 2007, the presidential election was skewed to benefit one candidate. That's the electoral body skewed the elections in order to benefit one of the candidates. And those of us who were on the same ticket as the presidential candidate got swept up in the same style win like the presidential candidates. I didn't personally go there to rig because of the preponderance of strength of the party in our locality, but there was a reasonable expectation on our part that we were all going to win the election. So I voted and went back. But the results, when the results were announced later in the evening, the numbers were outstanding. Instead of tens of thousands, you saw hundreds of thousands. And then I was wondering, where do these people come out to vote as to get these numbers? So the numbers were bogus. So I ought to have just raised my hand and said, sir, I reject this victory because the numbers are bogus. But I didn't. I allowed myself to be sworn in the Senate, which is an ethical lapse. That's why I'm telling you that nobody can come out here and start blaming others. It's an ethical lapse. Although, fortuitously for me, my election was nullified a couple of months after. So I had the privilege of going back, be running it in a court-ordered election, fresh elections, and winning it legitimately. But I need to ask you, would you say that the win, the later legitimate win, cured the ethical lapse in the first one? What would be your answer? Would it? It would not. So that's why I'm telling you, I'm not qualified to come out here and start talking nonsense and blaming others. It is all of us, but we have to do something. We have to do something about it. I do not want to draw any moral or intellectual equivalence out here. But the philosophy students amongst all of us here will remember that Plato's apology recounted the story. Well, Plato's apology, for those who are not conversant with that, it was a chronicle of the defense of Socrates when he was tried 399 BC for impiety and corrupting, misleading the youths. Of course, actually, it was just a he was being scapegoated because they lost the Peloponnesian War, so they grabbed him because he was going around and criticizing the war and all that and all that. But there was an aside. There was an aside to that story, and that aside was the story of how the oracle at Delphi, we're talking about classical Athens, so they had oracles and all those things. Don't worry about it. So, and most of them is mythology. So the oracle at Delphi, speaking through Pythia, the priestess, declared Socrates the wisest man. Socrates was the wisest man, and not because he had intense knowledge or because he was the repository of all knowledge, but because he knew that he knew nothing. And that was unlike the sophists who went around thinking that they knew everything. So the fact that Socrates knew that he didn't know gave him the clarity to know that he had to pursue knowledge, and knowledge he pursued, he did. You remember his dialectical elenchus. So I believe that my self-awareness and consciousness that I'm part of the problem affords me the clarity needed to chart the course on how to solve the problem of election rigging and then to move our nation up to the era of honest elections, and the clarity to reasonably forecast outcomes of an era of honest elections in Nigeria. And so permit me to inform you that although it is very, very important to make bimodal voter accreditation system and electronic transmission of results by IREV all legally mandatory in the conduct of our elections in Nigeria. But I'm sorry to disappoint you that BVAS and IREV cannot solve the problem of electoral rigging in Nigeria without the neutrality and impartiality of the electoral bodies. Because those systems are vulnerable to manipulation. All those who direct, plan, superintend election rigging in Nigeria are the top leadership of the electoral bodies, who working with the politicians, work aggressively to skew the elections in favor of the persons and the political parties under whose auspices they were appointed, and who stuck in their visceral determination and unshakable resolve to steal elections in favor of their masters, will bring to bear on their quest this particular information I just gave, that these systems, the IREB, BVAS, are susceptible to manipulation, and that they can even manufacture logistical problems, infrastructural and logistical problems, particularly internet connectivity and power supply disruptions, and then turn around and take benefit of those failures. That they can manipulate the back-end data. They can do that. And that they can engineer system dysfunction and malfunction and exploit the resulting glitches. Or that they can even decide not to transmit the elections, whatever you say in the law, because it's always a do or die game for them. That they can decide not to transmit the result electronically or delay it until it is useless. All the point we're making is that BVAS and IREB cannot help much with election integrity without the integrity of the electoral bodies. And you and I know that the existing electoral bodies today in Nigeria, at the federal, at the state levels, they are not working for honest elections. They are rigging elections in collusion with us politicians for the benefit of those who appointed them. And therefore, the only way to ensure impartial, neutral, honest, transparent, free and fair conduct of elections in Nigeria is to devise a means by which the electoral personnel, these electoral bodies and personnel, by which they are appointed independently of us politicians, especially the president and the governors. I'll say it again, that we must find a way to make sure that the president and the governors do not influence or direct the appointment of electoral officers. Regarding outcomes, the outcomes of an honest election era, I took the liberty of commissioning an analytic study on what our future prospects would be if we conducted and experienced 3 consecutive cycles of honest elections in Nigeria. What would be our future, our fortunes, or our disadvantage if we can have honest elections, say, from 2027, and then we'll have honest elections again 2031, and we'll have honest elections again 2035. How would we fare? My study finds out that in the first cycle, which will be like 2027, the number of ethically minded and morally courageous, freshly elected politicians will be greater in number than the usual politicians like us by a ratio of 52% good and 48% not so good like us. And then in 2031, it will even get much better because the ratio will be 80% for the good and 20% for the not so good like us. And in 2035, the third cycle, it will be 99% good and 1% not so good. So can you see that what we have is a total makeover in quality of candidates? Can you see that? Gentlemen and ladies, can we see that? Yes, let's clap for Nigeria. We are making progress. It's good for us to have this discussion so that we see that some people have lost hope in Nigeria. I have not. I'm very optimistic of the country. All we need to do is to do it right. And our pathway to doing what is right is honest elections. And then you may be wondering, what about those politicians like us who squeaked through in this election? What will happen to us? Why do you have to have bad ones like us in the mix? Why? But I'm telling you not to worry, because in the era of honest elections, the people are now the sovereign. The people that have now gotten the popular sovereignty, the people's power, and that power is the power of vote. It is now the people, they are the new sheriffs in town. So both the good and the bad know that they will be thrown out of office unless they deliver people's-oriented projects and deliver good governance. And I'm telling you, it's not going to be from four yearly basis. The people are not going to wait to throw bad people, bad politicians, bad officers out of office. They're not going to wait for 4 years because the recall process will now be activated. And it's not like that one they tried to use in Kogi State. The one they tried to use in Kogi State to recall somebody. And our own INEC saw through it. Imagine when our INEC says that what some electoral process is bad. You must be thoroughly, thoroughly bad for INEC to say that. In the new dispensation under that era of honest elections, the people will be the sovereign. You know, Machiavelli tended to turn it upside down because he kept talking about, in his book, The Prince, he kept talking about the prince, the sovereign. Because the sovereign is not the president. The sovereign is not the National Assembly. You know, Machiavelli says that it's better for the sovereign to be feared than be loved. The sovereign under our constitution are you people, the people. So you now have the instrument that will make the politicians now fear you, and that is the power of honest vote. My study finds that these new politicians, these new officers that have been elected, where the people are now watching closely with their power, they would move quickly to do the people's work. And the first thing on their table is that they're going to legislatively set up an independent anti-corruption system. You know, the system in which the people, the personnel of the new anti-corruption system will not be appointed by the politicians, by the president or the governors. They will be appointed independently of the politicians so that they will be able to now do their jobs without fear or favor, and they will chase all errants, all bad people with equal intensity. Nobody will be above the law. Let me remind you that I said I'm not speaking here as an anti-corruption activist. The reason is that I am not worthy. And I don't think most of my colleagues are. And because that we're not worthy, that's why we need the internal controls to help us to tie our hands to do the people's work. That's why we need those internal controls. And what bigger control would you have than an independent electoral body that has not been appointed by the politicians, or an anti-corruption system that the politicians have no hand in appointing? That's the greatest control. You know, James Madison, writing in the Federalist Papers just around when we were preparing the Constitution of America, he said, and I quote, that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal control would be necessary. Human beings are not angels. Nobody. Well, I know I'm not. I don't know, maybe some of you are, but I know I'm not. And I know that the politicians, most of my colleagues, politicians, are not. But we're governing men. We politicians are not angels, but they're governing men. And you know what Madison just said? That if you're governing men, you need controls. But if you're an angel, you don't need control because you're like God. So we need controls. And the controls are what have been laid out. One, independently appointed electoral body personnel, independently appointed personnel of the anti-corruption agency. There are others. Separation of powers amongst the branches of government, checks and balances amongst the branches of government and institutions of government. And my study finds that in the honest election period, there will be a palpable straightening of separation of powers and the accompanying checks and balances. Because under our presidential system of government, the branches of government have been made constitutionally and purposely made separate and equal in order to avoid tyranny and maladministration, so that one person cannot take all the power and use that to begin to oppress others. That is why it's like that. But since inception, unfortunately, the observance of separation of powers and checks and balances have been rather weak, most times non-existent, leading to abuse of office, abuse of power, misgovernance, erosion in the rule of law, humongous waste, unaccountability, untransparency, bad management of our fiscal and monetary policies, and discouragement of foreign direct investment. You know, what has happened now is the whole governance. Once one arm of the government is not checking what the other arm is doing, what you have is all I've just enumerated. That is that. The National Assembly has been called out many times and by so many people for turning itself into a rubber stamping legislature. Remember, I was there, and when I was there, it was the same. So I am as responsible for the weaknesses there as those who are there now. We can't count. The only thing is that we have to talk about it, because it's only by talking about it and owning our mistakes that we can correct them. So just remember that yours truly here is as guilty as others. There's no I'm sorry about it, but that's the way it is. You know, I was watching Tunde Bakare, Pastor Tunde Bakare. We vented fulminations, demonstrations, you know, with invectives. He was scolding with strong words the executive branch and the legislature for blurring the lines of separation of powers and snuffing out checks and balances. He said, he declared the National Assembly now as an extension of the executive branch. Tunde Bakare now said that the National Assembly is the 41st member of the cabinet of the president. And he now said something that, you know, for the purpose of accuracy, I'm going to quote. He says that the nation is today bedeviled by a captured National Assembly. End of quote. Strong words, but the situation is serious because without separation of powers, you see the problems we'll be having. But nothing vindicates Tunde Bakare's captured National Assembly troop than the role played by the legislature in the recent proclamation of state of emergency in Rivers State and the removal or suspension of Governor Saga. Because, firstly, the combined effects of sections 188, 189, 305, subsections 4 and 5, dealing with tenure of office and cessation of office of a governor, and the scenarios for proclaiming a state of emergency. None of these sections show that the Constitution has given the president the power to remove a governor. None. So the National Assembly ought to have spoken at the earliest opportunity, because the fact that we have separation of powers does not mean that we have brick walls separating the branches of government. You know, there are still consultations going on. So at the very first opportunity when they were briefed on it, the National Assembly ought to have said, Mr. President, we need to rethink this. Because you remember watching our sitting Vice President, Elijah Shetima. By the way, Shetima, he speaks beautifully well and with good cadences to his tone, and he's very weighty. So I like watching him speak. I saw him, I saw the flicker where he was speaking, I put it on, and he was indulging himself in reminiscences. He was remembering how he would have been removed as the governor of Borno State. He was almost removed as the governor of Borno State by the then president. But for the intervention of the then Speaker of the House of Representatives, Aminu Waziri Tambuwal, he advised the president then, he said, Mr. President, you do not have the power to remove an elected councillor. How much more an elected governor? And of course, with the concurrence of opinion with the Attorney General and some other senior counsel, that the then president pulled back. So this is what was expected in this scenario, that the National Assembly ought to have spoken immediately. We said, Mr. President, please, let's rethink this thing so that we don't make any mistake. It doesn't seem that happened. And secondly, the Constitution provides a backup, because by virtue of sections 305, subsection 6b, the proclamation of emergency by the president dies a natural death in 2 days if the National Assembly is in session, or in 10 days if they are not in session and ought to be called back. Unless the National Assembly approves the proclamation, and then it gains life. Otherwise, it's dead. And the approval, as mandated by the Constitution, will be by concurrent resolutions of the Senate and the House of Representatives, supported by at least 2/3 majorities of all senators and all members of the House of Representatives. Meaning that we needed at least the minimum 73 senators and 240 honorable members of House of Representatives to approve, to give life to the proclamation of emergency. Otherwise, it dies. And how do you know if a number of 73 is met or 240 met? Is it not by counting? How do you know that we have 73 here? Is it not by counting? It's by counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. But the people are aghast because they say that most shockingly that the National Assembly, saying that perhaps they didn't have the numbers, resorted to a voice vote. Voice vote is usually by estimation. You know, when the Senate President will say those in favor say aye, everybody will say unison, aye. And when he says those against say nay, they will say nays. So ask yourself, how is it possible? What all of us here shout ayes, and some shout nays. How do you know the number that shouted yes and the one that said no, without division and enumeration? So you say it. So as far as the people are concerned, they think that the National Assembly did this in order to please and appease the executive branch. And therefore, what you had was a voluntary abnegation of its equality with the executive branch. You know, James Madison, when he was making an argument back in the days, 1770, before the proclamation of independence of America and then the writing of their Constitution, he argued so much for the separation of powers. And the reason, his own reason was different from some of the Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, Thoreau. James Madison brought a different take to it. He said the reason why you need separation of powers is that each branch will jealously guard its territory to make sure there's no encroachment from one branch on the other. Meaning, the legislature will make sure that the president doesn't touch their powers. The president will make sure that the legislators don't touch their power, and so on. You see, unchecked power will self-accumulate. It self-accretes and creeps into power absolutism. But it was John Locke who devoted his first treatise in his work, The Two Theses of Government, to systematically offer a rebuttal and reputation of propagation of absolutism and despotism. Because he's saying that the power of man, the absolute authority of man in his house, is extended to that of the king. You know, his book was named his book Patriarchy. Patriarchy means the rule of the father in his house. But this man says that the same way the father has absolute power in his house is the same way the king or the president has in the realm or in the country, because the president is the father of the nation. And the power of the father in his house and that of the president as the father of the nation have been genealogically tied and traced to Abraham, our first father, who received his power from God. And therefore, that the president's power is a divine right from God. To me, it's utter craft. Nonsense, really. Utter craft. And he wasn't the only person advocating absolutism, because Thomas Hobbes also was talking absolutism, but on different premises. Thomas Hobbes says that Well, I mean, our nature in man is that we're in a state of anarchy. It's a war of all against all, meaning that all of us here are fighting, kicking ourselves and all that and all that. And therefore our life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And that is why we would do a social contract to hand over our powers to a Leviathan, which he named, the way he named his book, a monster, a ruler that will be ruling like a monster to quell the trouble. John Locke sorted out these two gentlemen. He said, look, our God created us and gave us inherent rights. The right to life, the right to liberty and property. Thomas Jefferson would add pursuit of happiness. But it wasn't him, because he's an epigram that's been there through the Enlightenment period. So, it should prove that we are right, that because we know that there will be some disagreement here and time, and we need collective security, we give some power to rulers. And the way we give that consent is our votes. You use your votes to give consent to the person to rule over you. And that person cannot abuse it, or should not abuse it. John Locke will go on to find two branches of government, the legislature and the executive. But it was Baron Montesquieu who added the third one, the judicial branch, to close the circuit, meaning that our rights now are protected, because if anybody is trying to abuse it, we'll go to the courts. Anyway, let's just remember that whatever may be happening at the federal level, is a child's picnic to the disaster happening in the states, where the governors are the despotic rulers bestriding the realm, towering over the state houses of assembly, where the members are without exposure or capacity to offer checks and balance. So nobody's balancing the governor. Tunde Bakare was able to scold the presidency. But who remembers the governors are everything? The governor is the legislator and the executive. Because he's elected executive, but he owns the legislature in his pocket. Whatever he wants, he does. Any bill he wants to pass, he passes. And John Locke spoke patiently when he said, and I quote, that it would be too tempting for human weakness, which is so naturally inclined to seizing power, if those who are vested with the power of enforcing the laws are also given the powers of making them. But that's what is happening in the States. Yes, that's exactly what's happening in the States. You could actually describe the governors in the words of King Louis XIV when he says, "La sate moi." The state is I, or I am the state. But let's not worry so much about it, because now we're in that era of honest elections where the people will have the power. They're going to use their power to infuse their power of punishment, to punish these legislators, to infuse metal in their back so that they can do the right thing. And they use that power to also oversight the executive, to know when it's overstepping its bounds. And because of the fact that we're holding elections that count, you don't need to go into the big party, with structure, because structure is the ability to rig. In the locality, you just put your name in the small party. And then, because the people know you and they're going to vote, they don't care about the party. And then you're going to be seeing retired senior public servants, family secretaries, directors, judges, professors, lecturers, retired who retired to the village. They'll be able to now go, because we were kept away before because of the nonsense kind of elections we'll do. But right now, when we're getting it right, they will come out, engage, offer themselves up, be elected, and they will march to the headquarters of the state to give oversight and check and balance to the governor. we're heading towards making progress. So my study finds that with these primary fruits of honest election, which were counted now, the first one is the elections. Elections in themselves are fruits of honest election just by themselves without any further purposes. Because anytime you hold an honest election, what you see is that it imbues a feel-good factor. It imbues state of well-being and confidence in the polity. People have hope because they can look and see that the people they elected are going to do well. And then you see the independently appointed members of the anti-corruption system. And then the separation of powers and the accompanying checks and balances. And above all, the greatest of it all is more ethics in government, because now the quality of the people who have been elected have improved dramatically. Remember, at the last stage, we got 99 very good and 1. So with this, there was a dramatic change in the fortunes of the country, because now the government is equipped with personnel, with the structure, with the laws to deal with insecurity. Because how have we been dealing with insecurity? If we don't have honest elections, you don't have anti-corruption system. When you put the money, nobody knows where it goes and all that and all that. So a lot of it, the government is now equipped, just because of the honest elections now, to tackle this problem of insecurity, deal with it once and for all, and then to offer systematized solutions to problems afflicting all the other sectors: agriculture, education, health, housing, power and steel, solid minerals, maritime sector, etc. And then including the establishment of a national social security system, particularly made for the poor people and the lower middle class. And with all these, the number of Nigerians that are poor, today standing at about 150, 170 million, will be reduced by as much as 70% in this period, this 3-cycle period of honest elections. And so, in order to usher in the era of honest, transparent, free and fair elections nationwide, under one independent, neutral, and unbiased electoral body, being inescapably the necessary and the only means we can lift Nigeria and our people, our brothers and sisters, out of poverty, and the only means with which we can reach the potentialities of God's endowment upon us, including taking our pride of place in the league of great and egalitarian nations. I do move a motion for constitutional amendment to provide for the establishment of a new, truly and literally independent National Electoral Commission charged with the conduct of all elections and for all elected offices. And that the new INEC be composed and constituted by 13 commissioners. 6 of the commissioners will be elected by the underlisted 6 Nigerian labor and professional organizations. And 6 commissioners will be nominated by the United Nations from across the world. And 1 commissioner observer will be nominated by Transparency International. That, I propose, will be our new INEC, for the first time appointed without the influence of us politicians. Of course, the new INEC will have the power to hire, to elect, and to remove their chairman, and to hire and fire all staff, including the chief executive officer. The election of 6 commissioners by the underlisted 6 Nigerian labor and professional organizations is arranged on a concurrent, corresponding, alphabetical order. That is to say that the Academic Staff Union of Nigerian Polytechnics will elect 1 commissioner out of its members from the Northeast geopolitical zone. And the Academic Staff Union of Universities will elect 1 commissioner out of its members from the North Central geopolitical zone. That the Institute of Chartered Accountants will elect 1 commissioner out of its members from the Northwest geopolitical zone. That the Nigeria Bar Association will elect 1 commissioner out of its members from the Southeast geopolitical zone. That the Nigerian Medical Association will elect 1 commissioner out of its members from the Southwest geopolitical zone. That the Nigerian Union of Journalists will elect 1 commissioner out of its members from the South-South geopolitical zone. Politicians and those who have held political offices will not be qualified to be elected to serve in the new INEC. And the United Nations and Transparency International will not nominate a Nigerian or any person indigenous to Nigeria. Their own nominations will come from their staff. And it will be the responsibility of the president at the appropriate time to receive and collect the names and curriculum vitae of the nominees and nominees-elect for transmission to the National Assembly for confirmation. No commissioner-elect or nominated may be rejected except with the concurrent resolutions of the National Assembly, the Senate, and the House of Representatives by resolutions supported by at least 2/3 majorities of the Senate, all senators, and 2/3 majorities of all honorable members of House of Representatives, and all voting in person. Voting in person in a secret ballot televised in real time. And for the purposes of this exercise, voice vote will not be lawful. I must hasten to add that the establishment of the new INEC will not impede or be a setback to the strides made in the devolution of powers to the state government, because in this instance, power has been taken from the governor regarding appointments of electoral bodies in the state, and from the president regarding electoral bodies covering other elections, and vested in a neutral body in order to trigger processes in motion for lifting Nigeria out of poverty. Let me clarify immediately that nominations by the United Nations and Transparency International will not in any way violate our sovereignty, because it is Nigeria as the sovereign nation that will make that request to the United Nations. It's Nigeria as a sovereign nation will make that request to the Transparency International. And United Nations and Transparency International would gladly accede to our request, because like all other development institutions and people of goodwill around the world, they rightly regard stealing of elections and rigging of elections as the worst and most destructive corrupt practice. And the United Nations has been undertaking anti-corruption programs and agencies in various countries with which it reaches agreement, like El Salvador, like Guatemala. And just the other day, the president of Honduras, Xiomara Castro, dispatched a letter to the United Nations pleading with the United Nations to come to the country to establish, man, and run an international commission against corruption and impunity. And they've already signed the agreement. They are now in the implementation phase. So they'll gladly make these nominations. And they have a vast pool of bureaucrats, of public servants, of anti-corruption experts that they can choose from all over the world, including Africa, in Middle East, in Asia, in the Americas, the Greater Europe, Caribbean nations. They can choose from anywhere. Because they would love to be part of this liberating effort of Nigeria to emancipate the people out of poverty. I've taken the liberty of preparing the draft bill for the amendment of the Constitution to provide for the establishment of the new INEC. And I'll be making that public, after which it will be submitted to the National Assembly for consideration. So, in conclusion, I will urge all of us to remember always that a supermajority of our people, our brothers and sisters, have for far too long been hijacked, kidnapped, and they're buffeted with hunger, disease, illiteracy, squalor and slum dwelling, unemployment and insecurity, all because of misgovernance principally made possible by stolen elections and rigging of elections and governing without the consent of the people. And so I will ask that all of us should stand up, or everybody in the country should stand up, so we join our hands with our sweat in shooting down these maladies with the strongest arrow in our archery and with that golden bullet of ours, namely honest elections. And then shall we march triumphantly into the outstretched hands of prosperity and prosperity. God bless Nigeria. Thank you. Thank you.